Hi, this is Fabian. Thank you for checking out my presentation, Webpack, a TaskRunner and Bundler Story. I want to mention that this is part one of a two-part series over Webpack. In this presentation, I'll be going over the history of TaskRunners and Bundlers leading into Webpack, pretty much explaining how Webpack came to be. In the next presentation, I'll be going much deeper into Webpack, demystifying how it works, explain what exactly loaders do, break down how plugins work, and lastly show you how to benchmark your configuration file. In all, I feel it's a good story and I hope you stick around to see how it ends.
As I was standing here listening to conversations, I was actually noticing a few things. There were some words that were being thrown that, truthfully, kind of like, all right, I'm glad I did this part. This is not the presentation, by the way. This is, I guess, a preface to the presentation, and not an intro, but it's just something that at the last minute I realized, you know what, I really want to throw this in there because I feel it's actually very important for JavaScript developers or just web developers in general to know. So at the bottom we have vanilla JavaScript or vanilla code. Right? This is what gets ran in the browser. Vanilla JavaScript, vanilla CSS, and vanilla HTML, right? In 2000, we'll say, of course, between 1995 to, I don't know, 2011, for the most part, your code was pretty well, it was near what you would find on the browser, meaning you would go to websites, crack open Chrome DevTools, and you can look at the code and you would actually see human readable code because it's as the developer wrote it, right? But as time, continued, we started and so this blue here is a layer of abstraction. This is common with many programming languages. Like for example, C, then you have WebAssembly, then you have, or not Web, you have C, assembly, and then computer or machine code, right? So we started adding more and more to this layer of abstraction between the code that we wrote on top to the actual code that would then get executed on the browser, right? So, the first go around, we had things such as, jQuery and Bootstrap. But then as years go on, we started adding more and more to where the code that we write, it no longer resembles the code that actually gets executed in the browser. So, on top now we have, JSX. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but you throw a JSX file in Chrome DevTools, it's not going to work. Then, we have like Sass, right? But as you see this layer of abstraction, I would consider like, if I could split this, they're like verticals, right? So as this thing gets larger and larger, just know that it exists. And the reason why I bring this up, depending on what your background is, it's okay to feel, disconnected from the code in the browser. I know that I did for a long time. Like, it's like, okay, I'm writing this React code, but I don't know what, how does it go from JSX in ES6, right, or ES7, whatever ES version, whatever ECMAScript version you have, all the way down to the machine code, to the browser, right? You kind of feel disconnected. You feel disconnected, don't worry, it's fine. Just so long as you know that this layer exists, you'll be fine moving forward. Web developers are not expected to know everything that happens in here. Not even the authors of these libraries understand what happens because, like I said, there's vertical slices, right? With that being said, let's go ahead and let's get started. Today, we're talking about Webpack. I know that, what truth are you telling me, Fabian? Are we going to be learning about, so the title of the presentation is called Webpack, a TaskRunner and Bundler Story. The reason why I called it Webpack is for two reasons. For one, SEO purposes. If I put in TaskRunner on the web, TaskRunner presentation, I'm sorry, no one's gonna find that. So I need something that catches. Webpack does that. And two, if you think naming a variable is hard, naming a presentation is even harder. So I was like, okay, I need something I can, like I said, it can catch. I think Webpack, TR Bundler Story, TaskRunner Bundler Story, it's just fine. But as mentioned, Webpack is gonna be a small part of it. It's building up to what Webpack then becomes, but we will be going over it. But there's just some groundwork, some things that we need to talk about before we get into that part of the presentation, which will be next month. Okay, so about me. My name is Fabian Buentello. I am a senior front-end developer at Dragos. Dragos is an industrial cybersecurity company focused on protecting critical infrastructure. What that means, we look out for the things that you want to make sure they don't go down. So this is your water, your electrical grid, your water system, right? These are the systems that you really can't afford for those to go down, right? And here's my Twitter handle. Probably should have put that sooner. By the way, how does it look for those of you in the back? Can you see this? Everything look good? Okay. Oh, and this is a history that I probably need to learn to let go. I am a former iOS developer. Fabian, it's almost about to be a year. Let it go. I can't. It's part of me, but just know that I kind of bring what I learned over there, vice versa. What I learned in JavaScript brought to iOS, and I did in iOS, kind of bring JavaScript, kind of help round me out as a developer. So what am I going to talk to you about? Kind of already mentioned it. Yes, we will be going over Webpack, but there is some history that we need to go over leading into it. And with that, there's this one quote during the research of this presentation. I have like 4 or 5 YouTube tabs open, and I'm just kind of and I'm just listening to them as I'm working. And this I came across Steph Baumgartner's presentation at DevOps conference in 2015. I think that's what it is. But he says the JavaScript community has this thing to reinvent all the stuff software engineers did 20 years ago. Yes, all the things that software engineering did 20 years ago. Yeah, like as soon as I heard that, kind of just snapped. I was like, yes, that is 100% true. Every single framework or every library that we run into, it always seems like the same wheel spinning over and over. So it was just something that I felt that I need to acknowledge this quote because it was really it's very true. But keep that in the back of your mind as the presentation continues. So it's a history lesson, essentially, right? Somewhat. But I don't want the presentation to be, PowerPoint with a bunch of bullets. That's what we did. That's what we went through in school, and it didn't really do a good job. So I felt that the most appropriate way is to, tell history through the eyes of a web designer, not a developer. Two very different roles depending on the time of, web you're working. So Billy, he's a web designer. I consider him, he's part of the early majority around like the technology adoption curve here. So you have I don't know if you can see, but you have your innovators and you have your early adopters, and then you have your early majority where Billy is, and you have your late majority and then your laggards, right? So he's like early majority, I would say for the most part, that's about the majority of, if you can think of yourself, more than likely you probably fall in that group. So he's a freelancer, right? So he's not working for a big company like Google, right? Or I guess MySpace at the time. So this is about like 2008. So he just he does freelance. So whenever tools come out, he waits for the tools, or not that he necessarily does it on purpose, but tools kind of get battle tested, and he then adopts them. So the timeline, I'll say this is maybe about like 2008. Right? I needed to get an idea of what the web looked like. What did code bases look like? What did websites look like, right? So a colleague of mine, I spoke with him named Dan Steinman. I asked him, I was like, hey, Dan, how did project structures look like? How did, that code look like? Because you can't see it in today's age. So you don't know what websites, how they were done in 2008 because of that layer of abstraction that we have, right? So he mentions, or he explains that you typically have like you have a global script, a file with all your bunch of your global variables that kind of handle showing and hiding the components on the web page. But essentially just saying that, with this approach, you had to be aware of your script tags. Like, okay, I need to import. Like I said, these are things that we no longer have to worry about anymore. But this definitely was pretty. This would essentially break your application if you didn't load your scripts in the right order, right? So this being like the global.js that more than likely was at the top. So let's get into it. It's about 2008, right? So this is Billy's first code base. So he has this CSS, and don't worry, code's not going to be this small again. I promise you that, because we're going to be working with files, right? Images of files. So he has this CSS, he has this JavaScript, and he has an image file and a font file. And he has his HTML, right? And so all he has to do is make sure that the paths for these files match the paths that are inside of his HTML, right? That's it. He would he would grab his code as he coded it up and upload into his server, hit deploy, even though there's really no deploy at the time. But that's the code, that's the time that I was mentioning where you can crack open a website and you would see the code that the developer wrote pretty much, word for word or variable for variable, right? And what comes out the other side is a website that looks like this. Probably not Google Analytics though, but I just needed to find a site of the time. So this is like, I think it's Google 2008. So this is what it looked like. I want to, take some of you back down memory lane. And then this is what after that, or not after that, but I said there's like there was a series of events that happened externally to JavaScript that really did play a significant role in shaping or forming or play a significant role as to what it then became. This was what I would call the perfect storm. And so like the first thing, and this is all subjective, like anyone, you ask anyone what they consider the perfect storm, they will say something else. They will say something else. This is just what I think was pretty big for the community. The first thing was jQuery. In 2006, jQuery, a utility library, a utility library that allowed cross-platform compatibility, or it was a cross-platform library that you would, at the time you would either as you were working, you had to know like, okay, well, in this, if this website's being viewed in in Internet Explorer, I need to code it this way. If it's viewed in Firefox, I need to do it that way, right? So jQuery kind of just added a layer of abstraction for us to just code it in one way, and it worked everywhere, right? The next big thing was the iPhone. I'm sorry, you Android developers, please don't walk away just yet, but hear me out here. Prior to the iPhone, the internet was the only way you access the internet, like the way that the internet now, was on a laptop, on a desktop, right? What you saw on your phone was a mobile version of the internet. If you remember the m.newyorktimes.com or MySpace, Facebook.com, right? It's really crappy version, right? Or crappy experience. But the iPhone was really the first device that essentially put the internet as you know it today in your hand and essentially shaped how the internet should look on mobile devices moving forward, including tablets, right? The next thing is Node.js in 2009. It was created by Ryan Dahl. So it allowed us to essentially have one language down that entire, it gave us the full stack. So we have JavaScript in the server as well as on the front end, right? In 2010 is when NPM, so pretty much next year, we get the Node Package Manager. And that essentially, you can kind of imagine what that did for the community. It allowed developers to share packages and reuse code much easier. This one, a lot of people probably don't think about how important of a role the killing off of Flash did for JavaScript. At the time, if you can think about it, not necessarily how fragmented the web world was, but if in fact Flash was not killed off, what would that have then led to moving forward? Like how would 2018 look like if Flash wasn't killed? And the reason why it was killed, of course, because the iPhone, a few circles before, and just to kind of tell you what the significance of this. So at the time, Adobe had about like 2 million Flash developers. So the JavaScript community was. We'll hold the questions to the end. But hold it, please. Flash had about like 2 million developers. Flash had ceased all development Adobe ceased all development on Flash in 2011. By 2015, it started urging developers to move away, and in 2020, it will cease all support for Flash entirely, right? So if you were a Flash developer at the time, you had the choice of one or two things. Either I go find a different job doing something else, or I become a JavaScript developer or a web developer, HTML, open standards. And then the final thing that I consider for the web, and ultimately it playing to JavaScript's favor, is the creation of Bootstrap in 2011. So the same problems that jQuery solved for JavaScript, Bootstrap did the same for CSS. So it allowed developers to create beautiful, websites with very little work. It did a lot of work. And so just to run through one or two more numbers. In 2012 is whenever they released the grid system that is oh so popular today. And in 2013 is whenever they, changed directions to being a mobile-first design system. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not saying that without one of these events that the JavaScript world wouldn't look like what it does to me. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that, I look at these events, and you can, if we were to sit here for 10 minutes, we can throw in 20 more things that happen. I'm just saying, just looking at it, it's like, okay, yeah, if one of these things played their role, and I guess we'll just leave it at that. The next one, just to show some numbers, just to kind of tell you the popularity of JavaScript. So in 2011 here, you can, just to see, you don't necessarily need to look at the numbers, but just know that the trajectory is going up, right? So these are the sizes of our JavaScript. So the blue being our first party, so code that you wrote, the orange being third party code that you have in your website, and then on the right hand side are like the number of requests of JavaScript that we've made between the years of 2011 to, I guess, 2019, yeah. But just want to point to this slide. Okay, JavaScript, it's going like this, right? With that being said, let's rewind, or not necessarily rewind the clocks, but now let's go back to Billy now. So Billy is learning about good practice. Now it's about 2011. Billy starts hearing about, like, hey, you need to start minifying your code. You need to, you want to reduce the size of your JavaScript site, right? Let's see. So we have our build process. What we consider, like, it's just a build process. It doesn't necessarily mean it's automated. It's just like, okay, I'm deploying, or I'm uploading my website. I need to have my little checklist of things that I need to do, right? So let's jump into that. So on the left-hand side, we have our source files, right? You have your Bootstrap, CSS, and on the right-hand side, we have the HTML, which is like our output, is what I would say. At the beginning, or not the beginning, but or right off the bat, we know, like, okay, our assets such as Bootstrap, our photos and fonts, that can go straight into our HTML. We don't have to worry about that, right? But as far as our JavaScript and our CSS, we want to start minifying those, shrinking the sizes of those files down, right? So what Billy does, as any web designer, developer, whatever you want to call them now, I guess they're in between state, he goes to the web and he uploads them, and out comes his minified CSS and JavaScript, right? And if you see a file with a little red tag, it just means it's minified. And all he has to do now is just he needs to remember to go to his HTML and just update the file paths, right? And that's it. So now, okay, that happens. He does that for about a year or whatever. It's about 2012 now. And NPM and Node is making some noise, or making some noise, right? This is according to Google in 2011. This is kind of to show you the trend of NPM and Node. So you kind of see it continues to going up. So JavaScript is really making some noise in the web world, right? And Billy is listening. He's hearing them out, or he's paying attention. And also in 2012 is whenever, companies such as LinkedIn, Uber are moving forward, or coming forward and saying, hey, we're using Node in our architectures, or in our system, right? So, okay, cool. So now we have NPM. So now Billy, he's like, okay, well, I need to start building out this process as far as deploying out or releasing out a prod version of my website. So the first thing that he does, he downloads NPM Node, and he downloads these packages. And here he's now using Sass. So now he's going to change his files in his source directory to Sass. And he tells himself, okay, well, I need something that's going to clear out a build directory for me. I need copy over some assets such as my fonts, my styles, and I need to uglify some things, right, or minify my JavaScript, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to wrap that up in a box, and sure enough, we have our first Node file that Billy did. So we pass the idea is that Billy will then have this Node file. He'd pass in his things, or his assets, and out comes his HTML. So in NPM in 2013, or am I already in 2013? Yeah, I am in 2013. Yeah, time's moving fast for us. Here's some, just some numbers behind it. So the total number of packages on NPM, it jumps from 20,000 to over 50,000, right? So it just doubles in that year. And the package downloads per month, this is what was so surprising. In the beginning of 2013, okay, I want to make sure I'm showing that slide. Okay, cool. the beginning of 2013, 20 million packages downloaded a month. By the end of the year, it jumps up to over 125 packages a month, right? So just kind of tell you, okay, at this point, if you're a web designer, just you either need to get on board or you need to jump off, because it looks like this is the way the world is moving in the web, on the web. Okay, so Billy then, from this noise, he starts hearing, okay, he started hearing about these tools. One of them's Grunt, and here's about another one called Bower. We're gonna shift over to Grunt here first. So Grunt was created by Ben Alman. There is his Twitter handle. It was done in 2012. The thing to note about it is that it wrote to temp files. I'm not necessarily too sure if that's still the case, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we continue. But I didn't have a chance to talk with Ben, but here is something from his site whenever he introduced Grunt, saying that the lessons that the existing solutions, or the solutions that already exist, just didn't work for the amount of projects that he had. So he decided to build one. So moving back to this new setup, so he's using Grunt, which by the way is a TaskRunner. Sorry, I didn't mention that. And Bower, which we'll get into, is a front-end package manager. If some of you never used Bower, don't worry. We'll explain what that is and how that kind of fizzled out. But for right now, let's go ahead and let's focus on Grunt here. So with Grunt, it's a task manager. What we want it to do for us is to grab our SAS file, this new technology that we've adopted. We want it to transpile it or convert it, whatever you want to say, to minified CSS. We want to get our JavaScript, minify that, as well as move our assets like images and fonts, and then more importantly, most importantly, we want it to watch for changes to our code to then reload, right? So we're gonna go ahead and replace that with little boxes, and out comes a Grunt file. Okay, cool. So let's move over to Bower, and so I'm a little bit, I guess, sour when it comes to Bower. The Bower is a front-end package manager. Now, if you didn't get a chance to work with it, you might be asking yourself, why is that? Why was there a front-end package manager? And what's humorous is that you would use npm node package manager to then install Bower package manager. The reason why it's required is, I don't know if you ever tried this, but if you try to use require, like var underscore equals require, Lodash, right? It will not work on the browser because it's using the common JS module system. So you needed modules that were compatible on the browser. And so when you have, we'll say, for example, Lodash, right? Very, very common library, or at the time, _JS. When it would deploy out a version, right, like a new version came out, it would have to deploy out a version for Bower that would work on the web, that worked in terms of like global variables, and one that would work in Node, right? In addition to in your project, you would have a Bower JSON file, and then you would have a bower.rc file. It caused a lot of confusion to developers, especially developers like me, who at the time there's a lot of noise. You kind of don't know what to do. You just seen a whole bunch of Scotch.io articles and like what you should do with your code base. And I just like, whenever I needed to download a package, I would constantly think to myself, I'm like, okay, is this a node package? Do I need to use npm or do I need to use Bower, right? You always have to stop yourself and think. But the reason for that is because your node packages would not work on the web, and I'm going to explain how that changed in the next part. So okay, here is Billy's setup now. He has his Grunt file. He has npm on the here is npm and the packages that he downloaded. He has Bower, and then he has his files here, SAS, JavaScript, and images, right? But we're going to make a quick change real quick. We'll go ahead and pop out that JavaScript and turn it into an Angular file. So he's now doing Angular. It's 2012, 2013, it's 2013 actually. So okay. So since we're using Bower, we need to have this Bower directory, because you know how we have node modules? Well, when we use Bower, Bower needs to put it somewhere. So that's why we have a Bower component, a Bower underscore component. So if you ever cracked open a Webpack file and you're seeing, your JavaScript loader, it says exclude node underscore module / Bower underscore component / vendor. This is kind of where it comes from. You used to have your dependencies used to be in 2 different locations in your project. So okay, let's throw those dependencies into the Bower components folder. Let's go ahead and let's make our way into the inside the grunt file here. Now I need to say this now. What you're going to see is not 100% valid grunt code. Okay, this is built off of memory and also off of like already existing previous projects that I had. So please don't ask me, hey, can you share me that grunt file? Like, no, it doesn't exist. It doesn't work. So just we'll leave it there. So the first thing I want to look at is the grunt config here. This is where you would define out the options for your different tasks. So as you see, you have a SAS. You're gonna have a SAS configuration. You have your Uglify configuration, copy, connect, watch. Connect and watch. This is what you kind of need to do your live reloading. Next, you're gonna load in your plugins, and then finally, and by the way, this is where those little boxes that we had previous. Those what these are here. Excuse me. And by the way, there is some black magic that comes with Grunt. Names. If you download the Grunt contrib SAS, it needs to be SAS on top. So there is some hands and with hand waving things that happen here. But and so finally, here's where you have where you register the task. This is pretty different what we're used to now. But so whenever the user types out grunt serve, grunt goes to goes in the directory to the grunt file and finds the task that has the registered task serve, right? And we're just going to run through the actual configurations themselves, right? So this is the SAS configuration. There's one thing I want you to see. You have to tell it. So we're going to just kind of like zoom in or just focus here on the files line here. On the right-hand side, where it's like path to SAS, you would tell it which directory to read from, and on the left-hand side is what file do you want to write to, right? This is very different than what we're used to now, because now it just kind of like magic, right? You write into a file and it works. You don't know why, right? But before with TaskRunners, you would have to tell it read from this directory, do something with it, and then write out to this directory, right? And we're just going to run through the configurations real quick. So here's like the Uglify one. You would list out the JavaScript files, and you could use like a glob here where it's like, use the asterisks and whatnot, but you would have to tell it, I want you to read in these files, and I want you to write it to this, to this directory. And here's our copy. Oops, how do I go back? Okay, cool, we're back to the copy. So here's the copy as well. So this is, like these Bower components, Bower_components. These things weren't part of your actual package, right? These were in a different directory in their final prod version. You really didn't want to touch those at all. So you needed to copy those over to your destination file. So that's what kind of this is showing here. The next thing is the watch. So before you would tell Grunt, hey, watch these files. If anything changes in these files, I need you to do something, right? So we're gonna focus real quick on the JavaScript, on the JS configuration here. So you would tell it which files to watch, followed by the task that you want it to run. So right now I have it commented out, but this is where you would list out your JS hint tasks. If you need to do any type of like transformation, like like Babel or something, right? You would tell it, hey, if any of these files change, run these tasks. And then here we have the live reload. At the time, at the beginning, Grunt was using _JS. Now I believe it's using Lodash as a templating, the underscore templating and the Lodash templating. But this is what allows Grunt to kind of, you can connect different parts of Grunt together using this templating language. So that was a JavaScript, and here's a SAS one. You would tell it, you give it the path to the SAS directory or the file, and say, hey, if anything changes here, run the SAS task again. So here's the connect. This is the nightmare memory that I have of just TaskRunners in general, because it would have you. It's not specific to Grunt. It all depends on the setup. This might be a complicated setup. This is pulled from a previous, an old project coming from like an Angular boilerplate project that I had. So I don't necessarily know if this was the case for every single Grunt file, but this is the one that came with the the boilerplate project, and you really didn't want to touch that Grunt file. It was pretty intimidating if you think the Webpack files are intimidating. But here you would define out the options like the local host, and then you have some middleware where if in this case it's I believe it's copying over your Bower components to your output little dev server that you have. But okay. So like I said, you have configurations for each task that you want to do. And then you have our registered task here. So if when the user types out grunt serve, as mentioned, it goes to the grunt file, it finds that serve task, and then you would tell it which task to run. So in this case, it would, this like it's an example where you'd say like, copy over these assets, run the live, our little dev server here, and I want you to watch. And watch would then trigger, the JavaScript task and the SAS task, right? But this is just saying it was very manual. Again, I'm just zooming back out so you can kind of see the whole file as it was. So you said you had your configurations, then you would load your plugins, and then you would then register your task. Zooming back out of the file, we don't need to be in the code anymore. This is what it looked like. So you would essentially just pass in all your files, your components, and out came your HTML, and you're done, right? Now it's the summer of 2014. This is when things were. It was good time, it was great time, and it was also really shitty time for JavaScript developers. So boot camps were expected to grow over 175%. Like at this point, it's like we're doubling down in the JavaScript world. And I remember in this time, like, there was always boot camps advertisements showing up on my computer. But I'm not saying these are just. I just want to paint you a picture of what 2014 looked like. Okay. Babel was created in second half of that year, and then the Angular 2 announcement. I think this was in October, so it may not be the summer of love, but this is kind of like the first gut check or the gut punch that JavaScript developers had. So this was really fun during the research of this project or this presentation, because I would essentially put in a combination of JavaScript terms and attach a year to it, and I would be brought to an article from some person who wrote it that didn't think someone would pick it up almost 5 years later. But this is by Jimmy Breck Mackay, I think how you say it, talking about essentially how the churn rate of these frameworks or libraries is too damn high. I'm just kidding, no, but you essentially these frameworks libraries were coming out, and you had the JavaScript community or the authors of these frameworks didn't realize that when you actually choose a frame or when you choose a library, you're kind of you're contracted in that's what the website's going to use, right? It's really expensive. I don't know, you can ask your company like, hey, let's switch out this technology for this, and you'll hear them say, no, we're not doing that. But this was soon after the Angular 2.0. I think he mentions it there, and in fact this is that, because in his article he mentioned a Reddit post from 2014 that you probably didn't think people would find. I'm going to reach out to these people and tell them, let them know that it is on my in my presentation. But essentially, Other Mike here on Reddit talks about how it seems like every week that there's this new MVVM, MVP framework that's coming out that's built on top of these libraries that aren't proven. And it builds a following only for the author to then just move on to like, I'm bored, or what, that library over there actually is much better. It does what I want it to do, and it's actually built right. But this is just said right now. This is just a way for us I wanted to paint the picture of what 2014 looked like. So in this graph, we're now going to introduce this new tool called Gulp here. In this graph, we're right here in this highlighted line here. This is where we're at. Clearly, Grunt is still the top dog here, but if you look at where Gulp is, it's growing. That popularity, it's gaining traction here, and we're going to talk about why that was. Okay, so it's 2014, and we're switching out some of our tools with different ones. So the first one's going to be, we're going to switch out Grunt with Gulp, and we're introducing this new thing called Browserify, which is a bundler. You would install these globally. So Gulp is a CLI, but let's move into Gulp real quick. Gulp was created by Eric Schofstall. there is this Twitter handle. It was done in 2013, and it uses streams instead of temporary files. That's really important. The reason why Gulp really did grow in popularity is because of how fast it was. And believe it or not, not that I had to convince you of it, but I had it pulled up because I was working on it to test it out, see configuring that, and it actually is really fast. So I will give it that, extremely fast. But it uses node streams instead of temp files, so meaning you would load in files, right? In memory, it would do all the transformations that it needed to do and then write it out instead of reading in a file, doing a transformation, write it, read it back in, do a transformation, write it, right? Like that. It's IO is very expensive, especially when you're doing 100 different tasks. When asked, I was like, hey, Eric, can you please, if you had to describe what Gulp is to someone who is just now entering the web world, how would you? He says, so it's a toolkit for automating time-consuming tasks for workflows with a focus on performance and simplicity. And I will say that it is pretty simple. Move over to Browserify. So Browserify was built in 2010. I don't want to quote him exactly. I remember him describing that the NPM node community was really small in 2010. But essentially, Browserify allows node packages, NPM packages, to be ran in the browser. So if you can rewind a little bit, if you think about what Bower did, Bower is what allowed us to, use, download the Angular framework, right? Or, the jQuery framework for the web. Well, now we can just you can just use the node version and just use Browserify, and it would do that transformation for you. But if that doesn't make sense, don't worry. I have this illustration. So when asked, I was like, okay, what did Browserify do? He made a really pretty awesome description saying that you have HTML files with a long list of script tags, but if you're good, you would concatenate them or minify them in the correct order. That was very important with like a shell script, right? Browserify solved that. So like that complex problem of having multiple scripts inside of your HTML, this kind of takes care of that for you. You don't no longer have to, just so long as you take it down from Browserify. I'm sorry, as long as you get those packages from NPM. Okay, so here is the previous setup that we had. First thing we're going to do is we're going to switch out Grunt with Gulp here, and we're going to introduce Browserify. So now with Browserify, we no longer need Bower on the top right. So we're going to get rid of that, and now we're going to kind of move, Browserify, Angular, and Bootstrap, and we're going to instead now pull them from NPM. To Bower's defense, I will say this. I don't think that I did. It didn't make sense. If you really take a step back, like for example, Font Awesome, right? In 2010 2010, 2011, 2012, it didn't make sense. Like the Node Package Manager, what are you doing pulling fonts from Node Package Manager? That didn't really make a lot of sense. So to Bower's defense, it did have some truth behind why you needed a front end package manager. But the fact that you have two package managers is just really complicated. But now everything's in NPM. But at the time, it said you needed Bower. But with Browserify, everything's kind of just moves away. I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. Okay, so here's what our grunt code looked like, and here's what our Gulp code looks like now, right? And I am missing things on both code just so that I can kind of keep it together, but you can look at it, it's very different, the two. And the argument between them, by the way, there is a lot of drama between these two task runners. I will say that there is drama, but the comparison that you typically see between these task runners on the internet is like, oh, well, Grunt is JSON and Gulp is JavaScript. Well, in fact, if you look at the Grunt file, that is clearly not JSON. That is JavaScript. But the point that these articles miss is that Grunt describes the transformations. You would say, hey, in the Sass task, in the Sass task plugin, this is what I want you to do. Versus in the Gulp side of things, you actually do it. But yeah, let's go and let's focus in on Gulp here now. So whenever the user types in Gulp server here, we go into the Gulp file and we find, okay, let me find the same process here. You find the registered task, or sorry, not server, yeah, and you find the server task. And this array here is what tells the task which task it should run. So you have a task and you can register other tasks to it, right? Or you can tell it you need to run these tasks before you run your own task. But anyway, so with Gulp, we wanted to run the Browserify task first. So I was like, okay, here's our Browserify. Where Browserify, you would pass in an entry point, if that sounds familiar. And Browserify would then go and it would then create a dependency graph of your modules and be able to bundle those up for you. It only did JavaScript though. It did not do CSS or images like how we're used to in React now. It didn't. It just did purely JavaScript. And so here with the Browserify, we said, okay, here's my entry point, and we have a Bablify. And if you remember at the time, there was a lot of affi, like it was literally like uglify, affi, or something like that. It was bad. But as you see, in the Browserify task, here are the things that we wanted to do. And as you kind of see, we would read in from a certain directory, and you have to write to a certain directory, right? You would tell it to read from here, write to there, because my index.html is looking for this file in that directory. And finally, you would tell it to live reload, right? But okay, so pretty much like I said, it's very manual. Next is the SAS task that we had. So we tell it which directory to read from and which directory to write to. Nothing wrong with that. The task runners definitely did what they were supposed to do, or what they described they were going to do. And so finally, once we ran those two tasks, we would then run the server task, which was to spin up a local server and have live reloading. So what's the problem? Like, what was the problem here? Not that there was a problem, but compared to now, what was the challenge that developers face? So here's just a general, this is like a generic task runner setup that you have here. On the left-hand side, you have your source files, and on the right-hand side, you have your destination, right? So, and here's a task, okay? Task, you would tell it to read in something, you would do something with it, and then you would have it write to somewhere, right? And do it with our JavaScript here as well. Now, the challenge that a lot of developers face, myself especially, is that whenever you would do, so you would say, hey, task runner, run this task, and this task would be like task C, A, and D, right? So it would go out and it would do those. But the tasking hell that you would have is whenever these tasks then called themselves, and you would have this, this ball of mud. And it's not necessarily the fault of the task runner at all. It's not at all. It was, the developers behind these tasks, these files that you would essentially, you would download boilerplate, projects, like let's say for Angular or, Knockout, whatever. And they would be using these task runners, right? And each task runner would look different because you can have these tasks run however you would want. So the challenge behind this is, let's say you wanted to add JS lint to it, right? You have to find out where in the task runner file, okay, where do I plop this in? But yeah, this is just something that while looking at it, I do remember having this problem where I was like, okay, I need to remove out this task, but it kind of looks like if I remove this out, it's going to affect some other thing over here. But okay. So we have let's just talk, like zoom out real quick and just kind of look at what this process looks like. You have your source files on the left, and you have this black box in the middle, right? And you would pass in your source files, and out would come your HTML. Very simple. But the problem or the challenge that we would face is that we would spend a lot of time configuring this middle box. And if something changed on the left-hand side of the screen, we're like, oh, hold on. If I'm going to switch out this technology, I need to make sure that I allocate some time to go spend time in this black box and make all the switching and configuration changes that need to happen. Versus the way that we really need to look at it is like our HTML, our end product. This is what we should focus on. This is what's important. And this is also very important. But what happens in the middle, I really don't care. I should be able to switch out whatever happens on the left-hand side without it necessarily affecting what comes out on the right. So I'm not saying Webpack is the perfect solution for this, but it definitely is a step in the right direction, I would say. So Webpack, created created by Tobias Copper. There is his Twitter handle, and This is something that was really surprising, that if some of you who see this, it'll automatically click, a red flag will show, or will pop in your head. It was actually created in 2012. React wasn't announced till 2013. So when I saw this date and automatic, I was like, wait, hold on, what? This was made before React, yet it seems like it's been tied at the hip with React since the beginning, right? V1 was in 2014 though. So I mean, I think just kind of looking at it, it was created in 2012, but React didn't really gain traction until like maybe 2015, right? So when I asked Tobias, okay, what does Webpack do? He says, Webpack allowed to have code, styles, or any other resource in a single dependency graph. And this allows Webpack to automatically figure out which resources it needs. Now, I also asked Tobias, I was like, hey, I broke down the dates for him. I was like, look, React was announced here at this time, on this date, in these, in this weather condition. You made it over here at this time. How did this happen? Because I don't understand it. And I would literally be sitting there for, I sat in time like, okay, how, I must have missed something. So he responded. He literally just sent me the link. He's like, yeah, it was actually in this conference video. And I saw the video. I finally set some time aside. I was like, okay, I want to know what was the flame that led to the fire of Webpack that we have today. And it was a presentation by Pete Hunt, who is I don't know if he's still with Facebook. I've seen a few of his talks. I don't know if he's a core to React. I don't think so. No, but he definitely has he has his fingerprints in the React history books, right? But okay, if like I said, all this stuff will be we'll have the recording. You'll be able to check out these links, and I will be sharing out the presentation. But okay, now let's kind of go back into Webpack now. How does it work? So if you remember, we would pass in our our source files on the left into the TaskRunner, and we would configure the TaskRunner to then tell it how to spit out what happens on the right, correct? So probably the first thing that maybe some of you are kind of itching for, you're like seeing these Angular files. So we'll go ahead and we'll change that to React now, so everyone's happy. Waits for applause. Just kidding. No. So all right. The first thing that we need to do, or not the first thing, but what we end up doing is we get an entry point. We pass that into Webpack. It does its thing, and it goes and grabs the other dependencies for us. And then what does it do? It sucks those in, and then out comes the finished product on the other side. That is very different compared to the way that TaskRunners were done previous, or excuse me, it's a bundler and TaskRunner, I guess. But it's very different to the previous ones, because you would have to pass those in and tell it how to configure, right? So whenever you see this, when you see this picture online of Webpack on its website, and you see all these arrows, maybe that makes a little bit more sense now, because you have your JavaScript file, your entry point at the top, and it goes and imports crap ton of different files. It may not be JavaScript, it may be Sass files, CSS, GraphQL files. And out comes your finished product on the other side. Now, this is what made Webpack so powerful, that a lot of people, especially like myself, you kind of look at, okay, what's the difference between Webpack and any other TaskRunner after it or before it? So this Webpack setup would work. The reason what made it different is when we get to the loaders or the modules, and we'll explain that. But with just like with any Webpack file that you're probably familiar with now, is that you would hand it an entry point. You would tell it where to write it, and depending on which, so remember, you give it one file, and this file goes and imports other files, and those files imports other files, right? All you have to do with Webpack is essentially tell it, hey, when you come across this file type, this is what I want you to do. Because by default, Webpack, it treats everything as if it was a JavaScript module. It thinks everything's a JavaScript module. So whenever you try to import a Sass file into a JavaScript, without Webpack, it's going to throw a fit unless you tell it how to transform, or how to take in that data. The one knock that I have against Webpack is those loaders. This is actually coming from their documentation. This actually goes backwards, which is not very intuitive. This one does the Sass loader first, then the CSS loader, and then the style loader. That's the one knock that I have. I don't know why it's done that way, but as far as developer experience, This kind of may not be the yeah. Let's leave it at that. That's probably like the one knock that I have against Webpack. But the problem that it solved, and if let's say you wanted to add a dev server to it, that live reload, all you have to do is just install Webpack dev server, and then you just run Webpack dev server, and point it to your file, and that's it. It would run it. There is, I will say this, there is black magic when it comes to Webpack and how it does these things. But what I like about it is it allowed me as a developer to not so much focus what's happening in the middle and instead focus what's happening on the left-hand side and what comes out on the right. And all I need to do is, like, if let's say I wanted to add I want to start using GraphQL, right? I just have to tell it, here's how you take in a GraphQL file. I don't necessarily have to go and mess with different tasks in this tasking dependency hell that might occur in a TaskRunner file. I'm not saying, like I said, it's not the TaskRunner's fault or anything like that. It's just nature of the game. As developers, it's how we do. We would just get carried away and ask more tasks to where it's so far out we can't really see the full picture on how this stuff works. But with that, I mean, let me go ahead. I need to do some acknowledgments. Sorry, that's really bright for you. Very sorry. But I want to give a thanks to Dan Steinman, who was the developer or web designer, the guy from back in the day who kind of described to me how websites were made back then, as well as Eric Shopstall and James Halliday, and of course Tobias Coppers for allowing me to interview them and get some insight as to how these frameworks or these libraries kind of came to be, and really just put the pieces together. But with that, before moving on to like Q&A, I did want to say one thing when it comes to developing out any type of libraries, that the same way when we're making out websites for customers, users, whatever, like we put a significant, we definitely think about, like, okay, the end user, what did they experience, how should we act, or I'm not how should I act, but how should they interact with our website. I feel the same should happen with our dev tools as well. Like the same care that you put towards those products, you need to put towards the tools that developers use. And whether or not Tobias Coppers did it on purpose or not, it definitely solved the pain point for developers, because we didn't want to spend a lot of time in that middle part. We just wanted to, what happens on the left, what goes on the right, and that's it. But with that, I mean, I'll go ahead and jump into Q&A. Does anyone have any questions?